introducing Dan Palmer. He was willing to share with us his own work and his own process of working, and which is he called is the living process. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Jordan. It's really exciting to spend some time with you all. And there's one project in particular I thought I'd use to sort of theme and share with you. So I've teed up a few different kinds of things you can look at, some videos and slides and whatnot. So I'll probably be sort of sharing here and there and everywhere. And I am feeling it is, without really knowing you all that much, it feels a bit strange, but I guess I'll just launch into a bit of a presentation and we'll take it from there. But it'd be lovely to hear some voices along the way.
Okay.
Certainly if anything doesn't make sense. Did you want to add, did you want anything, Jordan, as far as you know, we're on the same page and I'm just going to launch into a presentation?
Just launch.
Go for it. Okay. All right, I want to tell you a little bit about my backstory. I was born in New Zealand. I ended up in Australia doing a PhD in psychology. After that, I was on an academic track. I was actually doing some teaching over in Massachusetts and whatnot. And at some point I kind of got sick of that. I looked at the academics that were 20, 30, 40 years down the track from me, these big brains on these disconnected from their bodies. And as excited as I was about some of the ideas I was exploring, I couldn't see the way from the beautiful theory to practice. It just seemed too much of a chasm to bridge. And I was spending hundreds of hours writing articles using long words that maybe 4 or 5 other academics in the world were ever destined to read. And so I got the heck out of there at some point. I escaped the academy. And it was a couple of years after that, and I went through a process of kind of coming back to life, coming back to earth. I started making bread and gardening and stuff like this. And I'd heard about this thing called permaculture, which is now a global movement. Some of you probably heard of it. It's around. It's you could think of it as a design system for sustainable living and land use, something like that. So it's quite a broad, comprehensive approach. And I got deeply involved in that and learned about it and started practicing as a permaculture design consultant about 15 years ago. And along the way, started a few movements. One of them is called Permablitz. Hey Dave, which is now it's got a website, permablitz.net, and there's kind of hubs all over the world, and people host permablitzes and organize permablitzes, which is a bunch of people show up to someone's backyard, their garden, on a certain day, and there's been a process of designing the space prior, and it's all voluntary and whatnot. And then a company called Very Edible Gardens, and over the years we started to have hundreds of experiences of working with clients and helping them design their spaces. And I was using a relatively traditional process. I came to realize permaculture has a radical feel to it, but as I went along, I started to bump into some of the same issues that Alexander talks about. There's a focus on, at the end of the day, there's a focus on detailed master plans up front. It's much more rational than intuitive or acknowledging the role of feelings. It makes lots of splits, like it prioritizes function over beauty, rational over feeling. It honors a fairly rigid split or separation between design and implementation and whatnot. And there was just a whole bunch of symptoms or cracks that started appearing in some of the projects I was doing. I had a few spectacular failures and started to reflect and realize there's something wrong with the process here. It's not, initially I assumed there was something wrong with me, but then I started pointing the finger at the process, and I started to look at it because permaculture is, it self-identifies as a design discipline, and the core of permaculture really is design. So I sort of asked the question, what is the design process here? And along the way, I encountered this interesting character called Christopher Alexander. Some friends had a book on their bookshelf in New Zealand. It was called The Timeless Way of Building, the first book I read. And I opened it up and I read this amazing passage about the idea that a living process that can generate life and buildings and gardens or whatever, it doesn't, it can't work by adding preformed modular parts. You can't assemble your way to life. You can assemble your way to a machine or something. But things that have life come about in a very different way. And so this idea of differentiation. And I remember I quoted that and I used it in some of the notes we were teaching from for 4 or 5 years. I can't remember the exact process, but at some point I started to look at some other books. And a significant one for me was The Battle for the Life and Beauty of the Earth, which I loved. I found it so captivating. And then that launched me into the Nature of Order series. And book 2, it's a cliched statement, but I got to say, it just changed my life, or it changed my whole approach to design. And so just my mind was blown, all these epiphanies, and I was well enough into my career as a design consultant to have an active place to play around with the ideas, which I've been doing ever since. And so as far as I know, I'm one of the biggest fans of Alexander's work in the Southern Hemisphere. And I've been very actively playing around with exploring, developing the ideas, integrating other ideas into them as I've been going along. And I have a habit of kind of founding things or starting things. And the language, the way I'm describing the kind of work I'm doing, inspired by Alexander, is living design process, which is only, it's a pretty short step from his living process to living design process. And so I want to tell you share some examples of how that's playing out. Oh yeah, I'll just share my screen and show you one article that was part of the story here. So this is probably 3.5 years back, something like that. I have a blog project called Making Permaculture Stronger. And I wrote an article at the very beginning of that called Christopher Alexander's Neglected Challenge to Permaculture. And I pointed out that that Alexander and permaculture actually start from a similar place. And permaculture was founded by 2 Australians, one who's passed on and one who's a close friend and colleague of mine who lives just down the road. So it's been useful to discuss this stuff with him, and he's incredibly supportive of the work I'm doing. And part of what I'm doing is bringing Alexander's thinking to permaculture. Anyway, I made the point they both start in the same place. They both aspire towards life and participating in life and enhancing life. Alexander asked the question from the beginning, what kind of process would generate life and deep beauty? Permaculture takes a different tack. It keeps its eye on the kind of same goal of living, harmonizing with ecologies and life. But it kind of, in my view, it unconsciously imbibed or just reached and grabbed the dominant design understandings from our culture, which unfortunately can't get you to life. And so permaculture's got this pretty major, I think of it as an existential crisis, a pretty significant dilemma on its hands. And anyway, this article generated a huge amount there's some controversy, a lot of interest and discussion. And from there, I went on to say, well, practically, how would it work to bring ideas and Alexander's ideas into the mix? Alrighty, so I think I'll frame what I share from here in the context of an example, and I'll tell a bit of a story about the example, because to me, the whole experience has been like living a sequel to this book, The Battle for the Life and Beauty of the Earth. And I've been involved in a battle of sorts. Nothing as battle-ish as Alexander. It's actually been a pretty one-sided battle for whatever reason. But I was invited to act as the landscape architect on a 700 apartment suburban residential development in the city of Melbourne, that I live just outside of. For one reason or another, the developer had interest in our little business. And so we had some pretty robust and serious conversations about what would it mean to work together, because that stage living design process was alive for me. And so I spent a bit of time looking in his eyes. And at one point I remember he went to his boardroom and I said, look, you need to understand something of how I work, because it has consequences that might not be that straightforward or simple. And I want you to know what you're signing up for if you're signing up to work with me. And I said, and there was a whiteboard in the room. I said, so maybe I can draw you some pictures and stuff and give you a feel for it. And maybe you want to have an offsider come and listen too, to get their opinion. So he called someone in, and I went through and laid out the way I see development and conventional architecture working today, mostly which came from my reading of Alexander. I didn't have anything to do really with real actual architects. And I was excited at the prospect of being able to learn from participating in a real project how the machine or whatever actually worked. And so I went through and said, this is my understanding. You grab a few pictures you like and you have an architect assemble them into a master plan, and then you hand it over to a separate construction firm. And it's not really about how it would feel to be a human being moving through these spaces. It's about creating pretty pictures for magazines that sell apartments, etc. And the whole time he just sort of smiled sheepishly. He was like, oh yeah, that is kind of what we do. And then I laid out the approach I would take, which is kind of the opposite of all of that. And I wasn't holding back. I was like, look, if we're going to work together, this is how it's not negotiable. Certain things would have to be true. I would have to have full control over the process, creative control of the process. I would be able to come in and modify what's happening during the build. And I would need all these kinds of access to information about what the place is going to feel like, because the buildings hadn't been built yet. And I was being commissioned to do all these rooftop gardens and parks and podiums and whatnot. Anyway, at the end of the presentation, I felt there was a chance he could call security, because I just critiqued the essence of how his whole business had been working for however many decades, and provided him an alternative that was going to create some friction. And he said, so what's the next step? And so the project commenced, and it's a big one, like 700 apartments over 10 buildings, built in about 6 major stages. And we're well into it. So the first stage has been built, 2 big buildings, and we've been through the entire process of designing and constructing 2 rooftop gardens, 2 podiums, and a lot of the streetscape. And the process for the next stage is happening right now. So I want to share a little bit of that journey with you. So I've got a few slides here. Oh, and you'll see in a second, I'm actually really excited to share this, because he'd already had a conventional landscape architect. So I not only got to experience the whole process and see how it worked, I got to see the output of a conventional landscape architectural process, which I'll show you to start off with. So we've got the design they created, which we can reverse engineer a little bit, and then we've got the design I created. So project's called East Brunswick Village. Oh. Now, can you see that? Can you see things saying East Brunswick Village? Yep. You can still see that? We're good? You may not. Yep. Thanks, Dave. So, oh, shit, it's going pretty fast. So that gives you a hit. This was an early render of what one of the buildings was going to work with, which I had nothing to do with, and was conscious that the processes were going to be pretty standard. That said, this building is actually built now, and it looks even a bit better than it does here. And just gives you a feel for the context. So this is a couple of rooftops, and this is what the pre-existing landscape architect did. And I think it's just a great example of how these processes work. And I don't even probably need to say too much, right? You just look at it and you see so much arbitrary imposition, where clearly, like the fact that this raised bed is a star shape is nothing to do with the space. It's entirely to do with the idea the landscape architect happened to have at that moment. I'll chuck a star shape in here, and same goes for most aspects. Again, it's not 100% arbitrary. It's like they anticipate. In this case, there's a beautiful view to the west And so they've got some seats facing the west. And yet as soon as I image what it would be like, or imagine what it would be like to be a human being moving through this space, it's just riddled with tension. It's just a mountain of tensions and mistakes in Alexander's language. It's like a mistake-ridden mess of a design. It would be horrible in so many ways to be here, even though it looks good in pretty pictures. And you can see just the random copy and paste and just all that. So I'll take you through the process I've been playing around with. And this gives you a feel for, these are the two rooftops in the context of the larger development. And so I started by coming up with an intention statement. And I want to acknowledge here that unlike most of the other projects I've worked on, there was a pretty clear split. I didn't have access to the human beings that will actually live on and work with these spaces because they didn't exist yet. The building hadn't been built, the apartments hadn't been sold. And so in that regard, that was a thing that compromised the life of the process. So I brought as much life into the other aspects that I did have control over, but chose to take it on anyway. And so I generated a project-specific pattern language, a sequence of patterns for these rooftops, and that I've been refining that now. And you can see the list there. And in a little bit, I might show you my latest pattern language for residential suburban rooftops in Melbourne. And if anyone's interested, I can flesh them out. They're all tension resolving patterns where the sequence matters. And so here I had the overall intention. I created a pattern language, and then I felt into the site by walking around inside SketchUp. One of the conditions of working with them was that I insisted that they give me access to 3D imagery, so I could move around the spaces, because without doing that, I'm just looking at two-dimensional plans. Obviously, a living process is not really possible. And so they sent through this sort of thing. And so I spent countless hours walking around inside SketchUp. So in this example, this is a different area. This is a podium. Again, you can see what the landscape architects had done. And I was able to just move around. So what would it feel like to stand in the middle there? And then you can simulate walking around the space. I mean, even right straight away, it's like, well, this is pretty awkward. I'm just cruising around, pondering life, cruising down the podium, and I've got to make this really sharp turn, and then I'm up right against this fence, and I've got to turn again, and I'm walking here, and someone's sitting here, and we're kind of encroaching on each other's space. And I was able to, so what would it look like if I went up to that apartment balcony? What would it feel like to look down at the space, and so on? So I did a lot of this to get a feel for the forces at play in the situation. And some of the forces at play that I teased out were to do with views. So what views are really beautiful and we want to accentuate and harmonize with, what views are kind of ugly and we be good to block them out, and what views could go either way. And then in permaculture, it's sort of automatic to tune into what's going on with the wind and the sun and those kinds of considerations. I was going to say things like soil and slope, which weren't applicable in this case because it was a flat concrete rooftop. But then I imagined many times walking into this space, even though it didn't exist yet, and what were the centers that the geometry of the surrounding building and underlying building would mean were present in the space. So I don't know if you can see it that clearly here, but like as you walk out here, if you're standing next to the edge of the balustrade fence, there's a certain kind of feeling. There's a thin strip of space, and then you move into the middle, and as you move through this little bottleneck here, there's a transitional space and so on. So just to my surprise, discovering that there's already this latent, subtle geometry, even though it's a flat concrete rooftop, there's already so much going on that I, of course, honoring a living process, want to accentuate and harmonize with. So I haven't got all the right here, all the many hundreds of diagrams, doodles and scribbles and experiments and mockings up and all that kind of stuff. But this is where I got to in terms of the infrastructure. And I actually want to read a little quote from book 3 of the Nature of Order series, which was that whether in public gardens or in private gardens, the quality of exterior space, from page 230, which comes from living process, has a particular and definable morphology. It is, I'll skip a bit about the Danube, an example. Nature dominates, but within a structure roughly made by geometric centers of construction, concrete, stone, which supply the infrastructure that allows the plants, trees, bushes, water to find their place. That is the essence of all gardens and all agriculture, that built materials, human-made structures create a setting in which people, animals, and plants can thrive. It is the geometry of these built structures which, like the shell of a mollusk, makes the growing of the garden and its resulting richness possible. And so this one is I see that it's like the shell of the mollusk. You know, this is the hard infrastructure, and these green things are raised planters that set the context for the plants that are really going to give the place most of its life. And this gives you a feel with the plants. And there's a lot of layers to how the patterns generated this configuration. I'll just mention a couple of things to give you a feel for the thinking process. So one was you come out of these doors into the space. Now, let's say that you're a young family, you've got 2 young kids who live in an apartment. So they've got all this bottled up energy. You take them up there after school or whatever on a weekend of the afternoon. They've been, I don't know, playing computer games or something, but they've just got all this energy. So they just want to unleash all this energy. And so I wanted a kind of a child magnet. So they see the playground and they head towards that. The parents are happy, the kids are on a safe playground, and their impulse at that moment is to sit down, keep an eye on the kids, and check their text messages, let's say. And so those are forces at play in the situation that I want to accommodate. So I've allowed for that. At the same time, let's say a retiree comes up there and they've got a sore leg and they've had a bit of bad news about something else, and they just want to sit and meditate on the meaning of life. They don't want to be too close to the ebullient energy of young kids. Like, let's say they want that's the antithesis of the space they want to be in right now. So how do I make it simple with the configuration of paths and options for them to move directly away from the kids and go and find one of many quiet spots to sit? And so on. So in my mind, I'd populate this, because Melbourne is notorious for its changeable weather. So in the times of year and day when it's agreeable up here and not too windy or too cold or too hot, you're going to get a whole lot of people wanting to live up here. There's 700 apartment residents that have access to these rooftops. And so now I've got the kids, the old people meditating on the meaning of life, and now like a young couple, 2 lovers, how are they going to proceed? They come and canoodle here. And you might have a situation where someone else wants to come and barbecue some food and enjoy the views with a few friends. And as they walk out, they have the option of not walking in front of the young lovers who are kissing at that moment. They can head off to the left and take this pleasing curving path around the back and so on. So you kind of get a feel for it. And for me, this was all about the patterns. What are the tensions that different kinds of human beings could feel in their bodies moving through the space, and how do I rearrange or let the geometry of the planters and everything else emerge in such a way where its primary goal is to dissolve or remove, systematically eradicate those tensions, so the space is as tension-free as possible. And I still love that idea from Notes on the Synthesis of Form, that the way you get to a tension-free or really a place buzzing with life is by removing everything in between, getting rid of the clashes. And so this was turned into construction diagrams by the architects, and there was renders like this. This isn't the real garden, but this was a render of it. I had nothing to do with those plastic stools there. And they left out half the trees we'd specified, so this is me telling them to put them back in. And here are a few diagrams of the construction process. And so I was very involved in this. It was ridiculous. There's so many emails and conversations, and then we were visiting the site, and the subcontractor who was building the raised beds out of a lightweight concrete composite was sending through shop drawings, and I was agonizing over heights. You know, I would often sort of, it was like a little Christopher Alexander was sitting on my shoulder or looking over my shoulder, and I'd think, oh God, the height of a planter wall matters so much. You know, like it's got to be low enough that kids can climb on it, but it needs to be high enough so there's enough soil and all that kind of stuff. So that was early on. It was a bit later on. Because of the conditions, we had to use a stone mulch because it's so windy up there. I'm going to show you a little bit of drone footage. So this had a whole different theme. This was a communal vegetable garden, and that ended up there. Well, for various reasons, but you know, by and large, the form of what happened was adapted to the context, and you can see some of these podiums down here, and you hopefully can get a feel for, even at this early stage, that they're a lot more pleasing to look at and to move down than the ones I showed you earlier. It was like I let the anticipated kind of lines of desire of someone walking down one of these spaces actually carve out the morphology. This is my favorite rooftop so far, even though it's going to be probably these are the first 3 of 10 or so. I'll just go ahead and give you a slightly more of a walk through kind of feel. So yeah, this one here. So the playground's going to go under that shade sail. And you get a feel for the overall, the way the seats and the raised planters work, and these are the trees not long after they've gone in. Fortunately, I don't have a more recent one. I haven't been down with COVID for a month or so. All these plants are a lot bigger now. But you know what? I had a little bit of a Christopher Alexander moment. I have them where I get flashbacks of certain books, like I'll be in a garden sitting by a pond and a dragonfly will come and land on the rock next to me. And I'll think of that passage where something like that happened at the Japanese temple, where he says, like, I felt like that dragonfly came there specifically to be with me. And I remember that beautiful passage in The Life and Beauty of the Earth when he talks about the moment he went to the Asian campus and there was a trepidation and anxiety about whether they'd pulled the thing off. I feel emotional just thinking about it, but the way he said it was something like, the beingness was there. The beingness was there. You know, it's like, oh my God, it's actually there. We've come out of the battle and we've created something that's alive. And I don't know if you picking this up, but as I move through the space now, particularly with the plants a bit more grown up, it's like, it's pretty nice. You know, it has a sort of a beauty and a comfort to it. And there are all these different pockets and spaces to sit. And so I've felt like we achieved something of what we set out to achieve. And for the first experiment, that was pretty good going. Anyway, that gives you a rough heads up. And these are some of the areas that are about to happen. Actually, you know what? It'd be good to hear a few voices, because it feels weird. I've just been talking nonstop for quite a while. Does any of this, you know, resonating with the journey you've been taking through the nature of order? Any questions at this point? Maybe just, it'd be good to hear a bit of your energy before I go any further.
Yeah, it all makes sense. Good job, Dan.
Great.
And, I mean, what I really like and got me very emotional and angry and excited was the comparison of the totally inhuman drawings that somebody gave you at the beginning, and you realizing that this is totally contrary to Christopher's approach, and you trying to make the best of it to change. But what really got me angry and gets me angry is that in the present day design approach, just everything is screwed up. Not just one thing that you can fix, just every little detail is screwed up. It's totally inhuman. And then somebody like you comes in and you have to change everything. It's just an incredible monumental task. Okay, and the second point, I want to get credit from our community. One of my favorite stories in the nature of order was the dragonfly. And just before going to press, Christopher took it out. And I told him, Christopher, what happened to that? He said, oh, I thought it was a bit silly. He said, no, no, please, please put it back in. So please, the community has to thank me for saving that wonderful story. Okay, thank you.
It's awesome.
Thanks, Nikos.
I was just going to comment, this is Kate, that this, Dan, has been very helpful because your description of your process aligns completely seamlessly with what has been described, more theoretically and piecemeal in this course so far. And so it's been very interesting to hear somebody, fairly disconnected from the course itself, describing a process that is, just going on that path directly. So thank you for that.
That's great to hear. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm so deeply excited that, like, this is a thing, and this is all really just from reading the books, and I'm part of a small group of colleagues here who talk about it. But I believe Alexander makes so many fundamental discoveries, and there is a common core to this that we can collaboratively advance and shift things. Like one thing I'll mention with the process is, like, early on, one of the comments the developer made was, he said, I get the impression if we work together that we're going to have a lot of arguments. And I thought, I'm glad you said that, because it means you're starting to understand this is not going to be a walk in the park. And I said, we'll see how far this walk goes. Like, we'll get a week in, a month in, 6 months in, and you'll think this is too hard, it's too expensive, I'm getting too much flack from the engineers and architects, I'm pulling out. Thanks, Dan, it's been fun, but catch you later. But every step of the way, and it's been coming up to 4 years now, he's held his line, and he's backed me 100%. I don't know, I think he's maybe a bit crazy. Like, I didn't even know what the hell I was doing at the start of this. I was bluffing. And yet every step of the way he said, Dan, at the end of the day, I want you to stand and look at these gardens and feel as proud as you can of them. And every single time I've come to him with a decision or a suggestion, he's run with it. And so for whatever reason, and he's a conventional developer, we've found each other, and he's given me wings. And when I sensed that he was genuinely giving me full creative control, I thought, well, I'm going to take responsibility for that, and I'm going to do the best job I can, to honor Alexander's work. And another flashback I have is that documentary Spaces for the Soul, which you can watch on YouTube, about Alexander's work. And there's this, just to me, captivating moment where the interviewer, Alexander's saying, look, what we're trying to do is something that no one else is trying to do anymore in the modern time. And the interviewer says, so what is that? And he pauses for a moment. He looks straight at the camera. He says, make God appear in the middle of a field. And I tell myself that a lot, that people say, so what are you doing with the project? I say, well, I'm kind of trying to make a little sliver of God appear on an apartment rooftop in suburban Melbourne.
There are some questions in the chat, so
okay. Mauricio, how to connect deeper human, personal, and human feeling for designing beauty and functionality. How better connect into deeper principles, or I might say quality. Connect deeper human, person, and human feeling. I mean, one thing that I've had to learn to do is to, like, above all else in approaching this work, is remind myself that I'm a human being, that like let what happens flow through my humanness. Like, so I have this idea of imaging life at work. So what would it feel like to be a mother pushing a pram down the street as a human being, and what would it feel to be this kind of human, that kind of human? And one thing I'm doing in most of my other projects, pretty much all of my other projects, I'm working with the actual clients, the actual end users of the space, which wasn't possible here. And I'm training them and mentoring and guiding and coaching and educating them to get out of the mindset of, oh, Dan's going to be the expert designer that's going to dictate what we do with our lives, to Dan's going to be our cheerleader and our support, and let us be humans. And like, one project that comes to mind, if we have time, I'll be happy to share a few examples. It's quite same process, but very different context. So the form of the process is different. which is actually just something I'll mention as an aside, that I like to think in that way, that I'm not only using the living process to design spaces that have life in them, I'm applying the living process recursively to itself. So the form the process takes is deeply adapted to the context it's unfolding within. So the process has as much life as possible, where the life the process generates is a byproduct or outcome of the amount of life in the process. But anyway, what I was getting at was that one thing I'll have clients do is just move around the property, you know, walk around, have a cup of tea, camp. Just be there and just notice how you feel. And I have a certain way that I let people, I get people to map their feelings as they move around the site. And I can show you some examples of that in a sec if you like. Did you want to, does that speak to your question?
That would actually be nice, because
yeah,
feeling maps were my PhD project. And
okay, yeah, well, I'll show you an example. Where are we? This was 10 acres that two families had purchased together, two sisters and their husbands, so 4 adults and 2 kids. And we started by what I call immersing in people. So what are the forces at play in the people? What's unique about these people? And I support people to write an intention statement. So for me, where Alexander has the pattern language, I kind of tease that into 2 aspects. One is a destination statement, where are you heading here, and one is the patterns proper. And I support people to evolve that. And often people come up with a statement like this that seems nice, but it's actually pretty generic and vague. So helping them get concrete and specific about what is it that is going to make you, what's drawing you here? You know, what's giving you will or deep motivation to pursue this project? What would it mean for this project to be as alive as possible? And so usually I have to politely tell them they're not there yet, and that'll evolve. So in this case, this is where they got to most recently. So there's some sort of clarity about what are you about? Where are you heading here? I think you get the point. I won't go into the details there. And this is part of it's in the pattern language space. So what are the different areas and activities that you anticipate happening here? And I do work with those to the whole process of clustering them and organizing them, which is essentially coming up with a list. I call it a holarchy. It's like a nested system of centers within centers. Yeah, which is in the space of a pattern language. And then move on to immersing in place, which was coming up to what I was talking about. So really encourage the clients to be leading the process. So I'm never having to get them back on the same page, because we never do anything apart. The only thing that happens apart is they do it and they have to catch me up. So the way I see it is I'm supporting a living process to germinate in their lives, and trying to give them the gift of kind of getting their lives back, you know, like being in the living process of actively shaping their own home and life. So I get them out there, and these are photos they sent through. This was the 10-acre property, a rectangle there with a couple of existing ponds or dams, and literally immersing in the soil there. See how dry it is. You can probably even sense there that at this time of year, this is in late summer, what I'm doing myself and getting them to start doing is just, how do you feel in your body? How does your skin feel? Your skin feels dry. You feel tense because it's dry. You feel tense because you're so exposed to the wind and neighbors and that development over there looking in. So just, okay, we're going to focus on those first. What are the patterns that are going to address those tensions? And this was one of some of the existing bodies of water, which didn't have we're just sort of done in an arbitrary way as watering holes for cattle, and they didn't have enough catchment, so they were kind of empty and lifeless, not doing much. There's things like concrete water tanks that must have been there first, and they built a house where the concrete water tanks blocked the view from the kitchen to the mountains, all kinds of tensions. But a major tension was the fact that the dams were empty, and this is a dry landscape. And so this is what I did to train them up. I said, okay, I just want you to walk around. And the way I put it to people is, say, this is very much what Alexander was doing on the Asian campus in terms of teasing out the pre-existing patterns in the landscape, is imagine that the 10 acres is made up of 2 big outdoor rooms. Where's the wall between the 2 outdoor rooms? And don't think about it, walk around and feel it in your body. Like, where do you feel like you're crossing the biggest, sometimes I call it pre-existing crinkle in the landscape or line of differentiation, because it's not homogeneous. There are regions of non-homogeneity or centers. And so I said, well, for me, what jumps out is that you've got the 2 bodies of water, and then you've got this low bit, high bit, and the bit in between. And got them started, and then assigned them homework. And this is where we come to the feeling maps. And what they did individually as 4 adults is they walked around, you'll be able to see some of the wording in a sec, and they just mapped these different pre-existing areas or lines of differentiation in the landscape or centers or whatever you want to call them. And they did that individually and revisited it, and once they were feeling good, they came together and swapped notes and went out and walked it and crash tested and came up with a consolidated map that they all agreed on. And so this was Anna's pass 1. So this area felt to her raised, good views, exposed, windy, serene. So combining the actual physical realities, it's windy here, with at the same time it somehow feels serene, or wind tunnel, exposed, food garden, question mark, flat, windy and present, happy, grove, cozy, flat, that kind of thing. And so different things appeal to different people. And this was someone else's first pass. Barren, sandy, compacted by horses, beach-like, secret, hidden. And then this was the consolidated one. And I would check them. I wouldn't just assume they'd done a good job. You know, I'd walk around and calibrate it with my own body. And the idea is that as you walk across one of these lines, you sense a difference in feeling as you move from one space to the other. And they'd done an amazing job, you know, better than I could have done. And they were so empowered and delighted to suddenly feel so intimate with their own property. And for me to be putting them in the driving seat. And then from there, I might as well just run this through, starting with the most significant tensions. The existing driver was horrible and lifeless for a lot of reasons. I think I've identified 9 or 10 distinct different reasons that driveway made you feel tense. One of the main ones was that it took you straight into the most treed, sanctuary feeling private place on the whole property, this area defined by the houses, where kids were playing and stuff. And as you drove down, you started to feel awkward and you didn't know where to park. And then you come around the corner and you almost hit a kid, and the people in the house don't know you've arrived until you're knocking on their door and they don't have time to put their pants on and all that kind of stuff. It was awful. And the other one was water. Those dams were so dry. So that was like the initial pattern is can we resolve both of those tensions at the same time? And in this case, we did a little bit of preliminary sketching, and we decided to redirect. And they actually made this discovery themselves independently. I said, just sit with this. How could you reconfigure the access to the property so you get more water in the dams and you protect the sanctuary of that area? And we both came up with this idea and then looked for tensions that this would create or wouldn't resolve, and then resolved those. And then, so this was the dam. And then I have this incredible earth worker, Graham Jennings. He's a master of living process. He's just incredible. You know, he says, what's the biggest tension here? Okay, that bit of dirt, I'll move that. And Alexander would have loved this guy. He just creates the most beautiful living things and weaves things like dams back into the landscape. There was a few, like 2 weeks later, there was a bit of rain. Now that there was the catchment from the roads, the thing filled up, and you know, suddenly so much more life and feeling to the whole place. And so we went along. One thing we'll do is the mocking up, you know, so we were mucking around. This is the tree contractor himself. So softening the boundary between design and implementation, and roughly mocking up where the trees would go on the site, and then grab some paint things that happened to be there to bring a little bit more three-dimensionality, a bit more feel, and to offer us information that you couldn't get otherwise. Get out and walk it and mark it out with hoses and stakes, come back in and crash test it. And this is what I mean by the positive space. Like my question was, and what I told them is, forget about the individual trees. We want to draw a line around the perimeter that differentiates the shelter belt that's going to resolve all these tensions from the open space in between, where the focus isn't the shape of the trees or the shelter belt. The focus is how beautiful and positive can we make the empty space in between. And we marked out the whole thing with string and tape. And I had them change it and change it and change it until it felt really, really good. And I even had them make clay models after Alexander's suggestion, which is just incredible, you know. So they'll send through videos of their phone moving through this possible driveway configuration. And it brings them more in touch with the project. And so quite often a lot of the design work's happening on the model. This is another client's model. He went a bit further with cardboard cutouts. And anyway, the idea is that over time, what emerges is an organism. It's this beautiful, organic, harmonious pattern of areas that are differentiated themselves, one step at a time. With you know, first we'll focus on the driveway and the water, get that feeling good, and then we'll come to the trees. And we still haven't even thought about vegetables or chickens or sheep or anything like that yet. But I know that they'll find their place in the system as we move forward. And that's gives you a bit of a feel for the early geometry of the space, which again, people come there and they're like, oh my God, this feels so good. Like it feels like everything belongs to each other and it's woven together. Whereas in the past, it felt a bit, it had a different feeling to it. Okay, so that was that example. Any comments, or should we keep going through these questions?
Yeah, I mean, please, whoever. I'm just enjoying it too much, and I don't want to get in the way.
Well, let me scroll through the chat. We'll catch those up, and then we'll go from there. From
Right.
Catherine, who I heard referred to as Katie. Dan, I love your work. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for sharing your process. The details and care of your work is inspiring. Yes, I get emotional too. Yeah, it's great. I love and try to practice the healing opportunity. Yeah, I love that word healing, and the idea that to heal is to make more whole. And of course, that's the essence of what Alexandra is all about, is making the world whole again. Can you describe the next examples?
I just really want to thank. I just really want to thank you for sharing that process, because I could really see how the permaculture gets embedded, you know, not just in, like you say, the chicken tractors or the herb spirals or whatever, but just plain old at a land scale. And just wondering, like at the largest scale, land scale that you've worked to date, and maybe how your process might change.
Yeah. So I work on a variety of scales. So at the moment, I'm working on a 400-acre farm, which is probably the upper end so far for me of in terms of scale. Often it's 100 acres. You know, it ranges from about 5 acres up to 400 in this case. And it's again the form of the process adapts itself to the people and the place. And yeah, and what one thing I realized along the way is that the process is scale independent. You know, it doesn't matter what the scale is. It's still what are the people about, what are the high level and more detailed centers pre-existing in the landscape, and then what's the best next step. I'm all about the wholeness and enhancing transformations. What transformation are we going to make first? And we've got a different whole now. The wholeness is modified. Wow, let's check it out and hone in on the next best step, and so on.
So, unfortunately, time is up. Then it's been a real pleasure, and I'm so glad to have you with us, and I hope you can participate again, and hopefully at least once more we'll get you talking when we get to talk about the fourth book, which is we're going to get into the hairy stuff.